Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the Strong Communities Select Committee meeting. It is Thursday, the 18th of November. We have two items on the agenda this morning regarding public protection and the Strategic Equality Plan. I'd ask officers to kindly introduce themselves as we go through the report. We have members with us this morning, so I would like, first of all, to introduce myself. I'm Sheila Woodhouse, and if I could ask members to introduce themselves, I'll start with Roger Harris.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Councillor Roger Harris, Cresson Ward, Abergavenny, and member of this committee.
Thank you. Paul Jordan, Councillor Jordan.
Thank you, Chair. Councillor Paul Jordan, Councillor for Ward Abergavenny, and also Chairman of the Economy and Development Select Committee.
Thank you. Councillor Powell, Maureen Powell.
Maureen Powell, Councillor for Castlewood and Abergavenny, and standing in today in place of Councillor Anne Webb.
Thank you. Councillor Val Smith.
Good morning. I am trying to get the camera on. I'm not. Yes, I am. Good morning, all. Val Smith, Lambaddock Ward. Thank you.
And Councillor Trehan.
Thank you, Chair. Councillor Jamie Trehan for the Overmorning Ward in Monmouth and member of this committee.
Thank you. I think that's all our members. Okay. So we have no matters to discuss on the first part of the agenda, which is the scrutiny and crime disorder matters. So we'll move on to part B, Strong Community Select Committee. Apologies for absence. We've received apologies from Councillor Anne Webb, Councillor Peter Clark, and Councillor Tony Easton. And we have substitutes for Councillor Webb and Councillor Clark. Declarations of interest. Has anybody got any declarations of interest?
As and when, Chair.
Thank you, Councillor Trehan. We've nothing in item 3, public open forum. So we'll move on to the first report, which is Public Protection 2021 Performance Report and Division's response to the coronavirus pandemic. So we have an officer with us, Mr. David Jones. Good morning.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, members of the committee. What I'll do is I'll put the there's 3 elements: the covering report, so I won't dwell on that because the details in the appendices, but I'll put that on screen. We're joined today by Gareth Walters, who's our Trains and Animal Health Manager, and also Jill Dickin, who's the Principal EHO for Commercial Services. If members have any questions we can't field ourselves, we can obviously refer them back to Hugh Owen, who's the Principal for the Public Health side of Environmental Health, and also Linda Gorman, who's not with us today. So, like I say, hopefully we can field any questions members may have. So what I'll try and do now, if all goes well, Chair, is I'll get the covering report up first. Let me know. Hopefully you can see that okay. Is that okay, Chair?
Yes.
Yes. Okay.
Yep.
So, like I say, I won't spend too much time on this. It's just like an intro and why it's here. So, members have been on this committee for some time will realise we do an annual report. Apologies, it's a bit late in the day, but you'll see we've been particularly busy dealing with the pandemic over the last 18 months. So basically, the current report just says to members of this committee, there's 2 elements to this. We look at the performance for the last financial year, 2021, and then we have a second addendum, if you like, Appendix 2, that specifically talks you through exactly what we got up to in terms of responding to that pandemic. So that's the purpose, is for members to undertake scrutiny of our performance for the last financial year, and those are the 4 teams. We've got 2 teams in environmental health. We've got trained standards, animal health team, and licensing. And we'll go through each element in turn. And then the second element of the report, which is Appendix 2, picks up that coronavirus response. I'm aware that members did have a presentation, I think, in the last committee that spoke very much about the COVID response and the impact on performance. So this very much focuses in clearly on a team that was at the forefront of that response. So those are the 2 recommendations. One is to consider and comment on the Appendix 1, the annual report, and the second one is you will see shortly that the impact of our routine work has been simply impacted by the COVID outbreak. I think that's the right and just thing to do. It was a public health concern, clearly nationally, and I think you'll find that we certainly responded in a very effective and professional manner in terms of what we did in terms of people, businesses, etc., which we'll get to in Appendix 2. So the key issues are outlined in item 3. The reason it's here, there were some budgetary cuts nearly 6 years ago now. So one of the asks then from Cabinet was to undertake 6 monthly reviews to see how that impacts on performance. In 2019, we thought, well, we now know generally what the trends are. So we agreed in 2019, pre-pandemic, we'd give this as an annual report, hence it's here with you this morning. 3.2 then, that's just a very quick summary of Appendix 1, which we will talk you through. So we won't go line by line, or we'll be here till 6 o'clock this evening. We'll pick up the highlights. But basically that 3.2 is just a summary to say we have been diverted to normal service delivery, and we'll explain why. The reactive work has continued, so it's not as if we haven't responded to tenant complaints about animal welfare, issues with taxi drivers, the pub trade, etc. That response has been there for the last 18 months, but it's probably been done in a quite different way. So the reactive response has still been there. What has obviously had a consequence is the slippage in our proactive activity. So as members will know, we are responsible for food safety, health and safety visits, housing visits, proactive trading standards visits, and that's one of the consequences of becoming pretty much a reactive service over that period of time. Governing bodies, we have got plenty of those within this team: Food Standards Agency, Health and Safety Executive, Welsh Government and others. Generally speaking, I think they're aware of the need to have a public health response to COVID, so we have kept them informed as to what the performance is looking like, but as well as internal mechanisms to review performance. Clearly we are governed externally as well, and hopefully that gives members some assurance as well. This is a bit late in the day, as I said in my intro. It's because we've been has been hands to pumps since literally April 2020. And that's why this report would normally typically come to you in May and June. So as things steady, we hope, over the coming months, but we're looking at the winter isn't going to ease that particularly. But as we get into spring, we're hoping that we can revert back to an annual report that's more May, June time next year. So I think that just then says we're obviously trying to link better with statutory corporate aims and objectives, and I think we'll see as we go through that clearly is something that we do quite effectively. Something I will mention as we go through is we have put a budget pressure forward, noting the significant work that is involved with this division. We have now put that forward for consideration, go through that budget process in readiness for April 2022. So that work is in progress. So Appendix 2, as I say, is just a comparison of what we're getting up to. Really, is a snapshot pre-pandemic, the first 6 months of that pandemic, and then more recently, the 6 months up to the 30th of September. So there's an interesting comparison of how performance has been affected. Should be noted that we have provided timely and professional advice to all those people who have inquired about COVID. We've been generally the first port of call for members of the public. Not forgetting our own internal staff, so that could be commissioning teams, social care and health, schools, depots. You know, what do we do literally daily? How do we respond in terms of trying to protect our staff from COVID spread? So that's been a significant piece of work, as outlined at the bottom of 3. So that's the reason it's there under 4. So I think that's the current report, Chair, if that's okay. So if it's okay, I'll come out of that one, and then I'll get back to the main screen. That's okay. That's that one. So hopefully you might see my chops again now. Is that so? We're back to. Is that okay? So I don't know if I just pause there. That's the purpose of the reports, Chair. I'm happy to get into the meat of it now, if you like, in terms of the appendices. That'd be okay.
Yes, that's absolutely fine. Thank you, please.
Okay, so without any further ado, I will get to the main report, which is Appendix 1. So again, hopefully we got sight of that. Yeah. Normally with a satellite delay. Yeah, we're okay. So that's Appendix 1. So like I say, I'll go through this and we'll pause for questions. That's the main report, if you like, as to what happened last year. So if I go through that, again, as I say, I won't go through it verbatim, but picking out some of the highlights. I've explained what the division consists of. That's section 1. 2 is the purpose. What were we here for in terms of service to the public? It is about protecting people from harm and promoting health improvement, fair and just trading environments for the public and businesses, not just trading standards. Jill's team in terms of dealing with pubs, clubs, etc. So I think very much is about a fair playing field. Improving the local environment. In Hugh Owen's part of the business, it is about fly tipping, dog fouling, etc. Some of those enviro crimes that we're active to try and improve. And air quality, contaminated land, and also safety and quality of the food chain, both from the farm all the way through to as it arrives on your plate. So we'll pick that up as we go through. Clearly, we do contribute to the wellbeing goals, as you'd expect, and we link clearly to the corporate business plan as well, which is running, as we know, to the new administration to next year. So in terms of resources, so bang for your buck, if you like, the staff resources are clearly laid out there. So the full-time equivalents obviously will be a bit less than actual people, people on 3 days and part-time contracts. So that's the commercial team led by Jill. That's the public health team led by Hugh Owen. Licensing team led by Linda O'Gorman, that members will no doubt know. And training standards animal health led by Gareth Walters, who's with us this morning. And we also have a support team then in terms of supporting all those frontline services in terms of applications, events, etc. So that's 34 staff in total, 30 full-time equivalents. So also just for info, corporate health and safety, that's Lawrence, and the registrars report through as well. The purpose of this report, which is focusing on environmental health, training standards, animal health, and licensing. So the financial resources last year, that was the budget, 1.37 million, and we spent 1.33 million last year. So there's a slight underspend there of 41,000, and that's 3% of the total budget. So we generally come in quite close to our budget allocation. So that's what we spend. So what do you get for your money? So the performance, as I said earlier, we do have internal reporting mechanisms, business service plans. I report through to Jane Rogers. So we do sit within social care and health. We feel as if that's a good line of fit. There's good synergy in terms of helping, supporting people and impacting on people's well-being in the community. 4.2, I mentioned a few of our governing bodies, so that's listed in 4.2. And what has been performance this year has also been monitored in terms of our track and trace service, which has been a huge impact. And that is reported through to both Welsh Government and the Health Board locally. So in terms of the table, I'm not going to linger on that too much, but I think the figures speak for themselves, and there's some sort of generic comments there, if you like, that if you look at food hygiene inspections, they plunge from 561 pre-pandemic 1920. So obviously that financial year finished in March 2020. That's exactly when the pandemic started. So we're on target of doing all our hygiene visits, and that's plunged for the last financial year because those very staff have been dealing with the response to COVID, which we'll describe shortly. So that's one feature of the annual report. Similarly, health and safety and other things will take a back seat as we've gone through this response. Businesses opened, generally that's declined. Like I said, I'm not going to go through them line by line. Service requests, you'll find that they go down for food specific queries because there was a significant lockdown, if you remember, from December 2020 through to the end of March. So premises are shut, then clearly we're not going to get many requests from them for business advice. It's had a big impact in terms of the actual lockdown, which involved the closure of pubs and restaurants for some significant time last year. So those service requests have actually gone up, but more as a consequence of COVID type related queries, as opposed to you know, temperature checks and general food hygiene training, that sort of element of the service. So that was generally in decline. Food hygiene training, none was done last year because the same staff doing COVID response. Communicable disease, just so we know, COVID is a communicable disease, hence that number of 3,800 of COVID notifications. Health and safety, that's generally Jill Dickens' team. There'll be some narrative under this, so I'm just going to skip through the numbers because the narratives probably gives members a bit of a clear understanding of where the priorities have been last year. So in terms of Hugh Owen's team, housing service requests, that did decline through the pandemic, but there was still a response, which I'll pick up in the narrative below. Noise, interestingly, increased from that pre-pandemic. If you look at the second from the right column, that's 1920 year. So that increased quite substantially. And also the next one, statutory nuisance, which is noise, not noise, smoke, light pollution, other things. So probably people being working from home more, had more opportunity to potentially sit on their patio and complain about the neighbours. So I think, yeah, the barking dogs and things that perhaps wouldn't have irritated them when they went off to the office space in this column, second from the right, became an annoyance to them in during the pandemic. So 1920, so quite a significant uplift in statutory nuisance complaints, and that includes noise nuisance. Another big increase was environmental protection calls, so that's flag tipping, littering, dog fouling, etc. So we'll see a big shift from 448 the year before to over 700. So that's had a big impact on that team. Similarly, pest control, again, rats and mice in your back garden. Perhaps you wouldn't have seen them if you went off to work in April 2019, and that became an irritant to you in the summer of 2020, so that had another consequence. So a lot of it was relating, I think, to people being at home, complaining about the neighbours and environmental crimes, etc., that perhaps would have passed them by in previous years. Licensing, so applications declined significantly, mainly as a consequence of the temporary event notices. Obviously, if it was illegal to have a mass gathering during a lot of this period of time, so people didn't apply for events because you can have a mass gathering for big portions of that financial year. Inspections carried out. So there's been quite steady because probably more about COVID advice and enforcement. So we were advising people about pavement licensing, what they can and can't do in their beer garden, the takeaway service. Obviously, the rules and regulations kept changing, so that took a significant time with licensing colleagues to deal with that. Service requests carried out, again, an increase from the pre-pandemic year, fairly steady to previous years if you look. And again, probably a bit of a shift towards more COVID-related queries as opposed to licensing for specific queries. Training standards and animal health, the figures are there, the visits quite static. The big increase clearly is complaints and advice. And as I say, we'll give some narrative to that shortly in the next section. But I think those figures speak for themselves in terms of general trends. And Gareth will talk you through that narrative shortly. Freedom of information, that's quite good news. They went down, they take quite a bit of time often. So that was a significant drop. And events, as per the temporary event notices, as you'd expect, events plunged in that financial year because of the legality of not being able to hold mass gatherings. But we did deal with some that proceeded in a small scale between lockdowns, etc. So in terms of the analysis, section 5, that we did have to respond. That was a national Welsh response. The environmental health plus training standards and licensing would have a change in emphasis, particularly in 2021 year, because of their professionalism in dealing with a notifiable disease. So that is why things changed substantially. I think people tend to think, well, that was good to have a track and trace service, but there's two elements really. One is actually providing that track and trace. So we had, environmental health officers dealing with individuals that had contracted COVID, and that was a 12-hour-a-day, 7-day-a-week response. So we had to crank things up somewhat to provide an 84-hour-a-week service to be consistent with other areas in Wales. At its peak, we had 87 staff doing that, financed by Welsh Government. But I think secondly, probably impacted particularly for environmental health colleagues, but also did impact on Gareth and Linda's teams as well, was the impact of actually what do you do when you've got that positive case? So it's care homes, it's schools, it's workplaces, and sometimes workplaces that aren't environmental health enforced. Avara Foods on the Heads of the Valleys Road, Abergavenny would be an example. So as a consequence of that, you've then got to follow up that case as to where they got it from and trace to obviously protect further spread. So that's been a huge response, both internally and externally to the council, in terms of providing that consistent response and navigating what were ever-changing regulations. So we've been through every alert level, and we've been through various guidance for schools, for care homes, for every setting you can imagine. So you have to provide that information so that businesses locally can understand exactly what the requirements are. So that's been quite an onerous thing. So in terms of specifics, so we've had the figures above, but in terms of a little bit of narrative to describe that, I don't think I need to dwell on Jill's side of it, because I think I picked that up when I showed you the table. Ultimately, the hygiene visits fell off a cliff, for want of a word, because we dealt with the reactive nature of the work, and all Jill's team were actively engaged with that COVID response. So they were dealing with licensed premises, takeaways. Often some would change business from being a pub to a spa type facility in a rural setting, which is great. So we guided them through that in terms of what they could and couldn't do in terms of protecting the public and themselves from COVID spread. So I think that was really the big impact on Jill's side. Responding to complaints, that actually trebled in terms of complaint numbers. So that had quite an impact on a small team. They were hit more so this year in terms of some hospitalisations. That had a big impact on the team, but I think that's probably more relevant for Appendix 2, which we'll touch upon. 3,800 cases of COVID, and each of them would have had a response of some form or another. So that was a big impact on that particular team. Income generation, we have been active in the past, as members will know, to have like a consultancy type service for businesses that want to have an enhanced inspection and advice, if you like. So we do charge for that, but obviously that has dried up as a consequence of our response. We will get back, we hope, to some elements of that next year. And health and safety at work, people tend to think it's HSE, but we do deal with all leisure, the St. Pierre's of the world, rest with us, ATS type fitters, that sort of business type. Other type fitters are available. We deal with all those sorts of business types as well. So that has been very much a reactive service in terms of dealing with that. The public health side, led by Hugh Owen. Housing, so again, we have to deal with things slightly differently. So if we could do it virtually, we would, but clearly you can imagine if we got a very concerned tenant with damp in their property, we didn't not do that. We did 2 physical visits where that risk necessitated a physical visit, but the complaint numbers did drop on the housing enforcement front. So we deal with, just to be clear, we deal with private sector housing enforcement, so it tends to be a tenant complaining about their property, and then we also engage with that landlord to secure improvements. That takes up quite significant time to do that. So that's the housing side. Noise is a big chunk of work, 366. So, you know, every day of last year, we have an average of 1 every day. Some of these are quite difficult You can imagine feuding neighbours. Often there's two sides to the story. It's a bit of a mediation service very often, and they can be very time consuming. So 366 was substantial last year. That went up significantly from the year before. Hugh there in the pie chart has just illustrated the types. So as you'd expect, barking dogs is quite an irritant, 1 in 5. Domestic disturbances, just people banging and crashing and perhaps repairing the vehicle in the back garden. Domestic noise, amplified music, stereos, people playing the drums, noise from commercial settings. You'll often have properties backing onto an industrial estate, for example. So you may have deliveries, early hours, that sort of thing. Construction, we do refer to the A465 dualling, which has been on for some years, and that does cause some disturbance for nearby residents. And all other complaints. So that's generally that's the bulk of the noise types. Environmental protection, this is a very large increase in complaint numbers compared to the year before. So we're up to over 700, so over 2 a day just on this side of things. So that was, we think probably more people sat at home thinking, blimey, that's annoying me somewhat. In terms of the black bags are stacked behind a tree somewhere. We do liaise with the waste services. They generally pick up these sort of random bags that are scattered around the county. If they think there's evidence and it's an illegal activity, we do intervene and try and seek out who that might be. So there have been 4 fixed penalty notice, and I know that 2 rolled over into this year. So the court system has been delayed as well, but we do endeavour to pursue fly tippers for that offence. Some success in terms of give dog fouling the red card. Members that are on town and community councils be aware that they've been active in terms of promoting that scheme, and we do feel that is making some real impact in terms of reducing that dog fouling, which is a big irritant, not just public parks and footways, but also sports, Bailey Park type situations, where they are used for actively for youth sports as well. So that has been a success as we've gone forward with town and community councils. Private water supplies is something else that the authority deals with. Again, these can be quite contentious with a farmer type situation where they think, well, I've been swigging this stuff for 80 years. It's good stuff, but often they will diversify. And if you've got holiday lets, for example, then clearly we need to ensure that we have safe drinking water as they convert an outhouse to a holiday let, for example, an annex, which is quite common. So we are actively involved with ensuring the water quality of those properties. Pest control, as I say, that has gone up from the year before. I think that's quite self-explanatory. Construction, I mentioned the 465, that's been a huge piece of work for Hugh Owen in particular, in terms of permitted work and ensuring that they're doing what they can to reduce dust and noise levels as that work has progressed over the years. Air quality is again a key point and obviously important to everyone. So we do permit emissions from permitted sites. We also do with petroleum sites, which we license through environmental health. That's in 5.27. We have currently 2 air quality management areas in Chepstow, Hardwick Hill, as you'd imagine if you know that area, where they trog up the A48. The Usk one is actually the 6th year now that it's actually fallen below the actual levels. That's Bridge Street. Just the nature of the traffic flows and it's closely hemmed in by buildings either side. But that's actually the 6th year we've actually fallen below that objective level. So we could potentially bring that out of air quality management area. We've kept it in there for now, but no doubt through those forums we'll make a decision as to where that continues. So then just 528 in summary on the public health side of environmental health, that just shows you in a picture, if you like, there's significant increases in numbers. So it's, you know, it hasn't decreased with the pandemic, it's actually increased. So that is a real consequence. And as we get further on in the report, we do refer to a budget pressure to say, actually, I think we haven't increased the staff numbers over that time, but the service pressure has increased significantly. So from an officer perspective, we put that through to the due process of budget pressures for next year. Licensing, I'll make this quick because I think I mentioned in the when we through to the table, I think colleagues will be aware of what they deal with in terms of licensed premises, taxis, street trading, etc. And some other things listed there. Request for service, fairly steady, but as I said earlier, it tends to be a swing away from the general licensing queries about, you know, pubs and taxis. And as per the pie chart there, it's more about COVID restrictions. What do we now need to do in terms of screening? How do we protect our public? Can we use the beer garden? How does that impact on live music? What reasonable measures do we need to undertake to ensure that when they were open, what can we legally do? So that took a significant amount of time, with nearly 300 requests for service specifically on COVID, the licensing team. As I said earlier, the applications generally were down by 500 as a direct consequence of events not being allowed for the bulk of that financial year. Then on 532, quite a useful thing, not to go through now, but that just gives you a bit of an overview as to how things changed continuously. So on the 13th of July last year, you were allowed to open outside only. So we worked with highways in terms of payment licenses. Cross Street, for example, you got those pods in place in Abergavenny. So we worked with both highways and the trade to get those done effectively. So then that changed again the following month. So you were permitted to reopen inside. So again, we were talking about table service, track and trace details, etc. Then that changed the following month again, opening times restricted to alcohol ceasing at 10 o'clock, off sales, sales, etc. And then that changed again the following month. So that's 4 changes, I think, in 4 months. In terms of the lockdown in place for takeout service only. So we still have pubs that did takeaway food, for example, or you could buy beer and take it with you. So some took up that offer. But the most significant thing then was obviously the complete lockdown for the licensed trade that occurred on the 20th of December last year. So that then continued to the end of March of this year. So then obviously things were very different in terms of dealing with licensed trade. I should say then when that happens, when premises reopened, there was advice which we'll pick up in Appendix 2. Legionella advice, if you've shut your water system off for 4 months and all's been there, there's obviously health consequences of reopening. Staffing, are people hygiene trained? So there's a lot of proactive work in terms of getting businesses ready to reopen. So that's that one. Taxis permitted to carry on trading. So unlike some businesses which you know, were furloughed, clearly the taxi trade carried on. They're still ferrying doctors, nurses, etc. to Neville Hall and doing an effective service in terms of doing that. So doctors weren't able to do the medicals, so there was nationally a period of grace, if you like, that we would accept their self-certification for existing drivers, and that's all gone pretty well. And also safeguarding training was done online. So things changed obviously as a consequence of not gathering people together with that COVID risk. So I'll keep that on screen, Chair, and I'm going to hand over to Gareth, who's going to give us a very quick summary, a canter through training standards animal health. So if I hand over to Gareth, thank you.
Good morning, Chair and members of the committee. I'm Gareth Walters, Training Standards and Animal Health Manager, as Dave mentioned. I'll just quickly go through this in relation to training standards. A little bit around feed there. The feed programme is a regional approach. So we lead for the Gwent region. Understandably, it did take a little while to convince the FSA that we weren't able to take proactive inspections when the pandemic broke out. I think the significant part there is that programme directly impacts the income that we receive because it's paid per visit. So effectively, that has a knock-on effect to the wider service. It was eventually agreed, and a lot of those visits now have been rolled forward to the current year, but obviously we're still experiencing difficulties. When I talk about the knock-on effect, when we come down to animal health, at the moment, the authority employs 1.4 full-time equivalent officers in animal health. We've actually got 3.4 at the moment. One is on maternity leave, so we've managed to get somebody with experience to come in. But again, that additional 2 officers that we've got are very much reliant on this additional work, hence the impact when we're unable to do it. Animal health itself, again, still very much reactive, very rural authority, and in fact, the way we work again across the Training Standards Wales is on a regional basis, and Monmouthshire is actually 50% of the South Wales area, so we play a significant role. And also with my strategic lead role for Training Standards Wales, we are heavily involved with sort of a collaborative approach. So Welsh Government help us through a partnership delivery programme, which again enables us to distribute additional funding to local authorities to focus on sort of priority areas. So there's a little bit about there. The additional capacity also then has been brought in to support the dog breeding project that Training Standards Wales has been asked to deliver by Welsh Government. It's being led by Monmouthshire because of my role as strategic lead. So effectively, this is a very challenging area. I'm sure many of you are aware of the illegal dog breeding problems that have been known for a number of years, but more recently have come to light to the extent that there's organised criminality involved, hence the need for us to take a proactive approach in dealing with this area. I'll mention a bit more with the animal health and work that's been going on when we come to the next report. Further down then, we move into fair trading. The 2 bits I want to particularly pick up alongside normal complaints that we may come in is a bit of work that we've been doing around energy efficiency, and there's a requirement for properties now to reach landlords to have their properties before they're let up to a minimum standard rating for energy efficiency. So we managed to bring in additional funding last year to look at this specifically in Monmouthshire. And it's quite interesting because, again, as well as your normal let property, what you've got in Monmouthshire is a lot of sort of older type buildings, protected buildings, and the implications obviously there are considerable. But again, that's been a very useful exercise, and hopefully has helped improve or is on the way to improving a lot of the standards that our renters currently live in. Another bit of work that was initially delayed because of the outbreak was the new implementation of the minimum unit pricing requirement for alcohol. We've now been able to deliver the rest of those visits, so again, and these source of income, but also encouraging from a Monmouthshire perspective that all the premises that were visited were mainly in compliance. There was the odd occasion where somebody needed a little bit of work, but unsurprisingly enough, that was actually with national chains, not with local businesses. Consumer protection, again, covers a wide area, mainly around the scams. I'll touch on it in the COVID report because there's been a lot of focus, obviously, with COVID scams as a result of, again, criminality taking advantage wherever they can. But again, we continue to work with our vulnerable people. We're making close contacts across wider teams in social care, again, to educate them so they know the signs to look out for where they are vulnerable people that are being targeted and victims of, unfortunately, these scams. With some measures, again, without being able to be very proactive this year, is not a considerable amount of work, but is a little bit around the fact that new businesses there as a result of the pandemic. You know, a lot of people have decided sitting at home that, you know, they don't want to sit there twiddling their thumbs, they want to look at other areas. So as a result of that, we've seen a number of inquiries across businesses wanting to start up and trying to find out about the implications. Product safety, initially, on the results on the outbreak, very much a case of people again trying to jump in on the grant funding that was made available by government for people to produce PPE because of the high demand. Also an opportunity for criminals to import inferior products and try to label them up as legitimate. So it was a significant amount of work initially to do with that, not just in Monmouthshire obviously, but across the UK. That was well handled from a national perspective in dealing with that as quickly as possible. What we're seeing at the moment now is as a result of incidents such as Grenville, central government have obviously been working very hard on what regime they need to put in place, because again, product safety, like much of trade and standards work, isn't sitting under one government department. There's a multiple area covering it. And what we're finding now is that construction products, which obviously, you know, as a result of Grenville has been put in the spotlight, is an area that really needs to be looked at, because whilst there's a responsibility for us to consider within our area who manufactures or who imports, again, getting this information intelligence is a different question. So again, there's a lot of work being done to coordinate that at a national level to ensure that those of us who sit at a local level are able to sort of feed into that. And the only other bit there is a little bit around the income generation, which understandably we saw a significant drop last year. Thanks, Steve.
Great, thanks, Gareth. It's okay, Chair. I'll just sum up on this and if we pause for questions. So I'll just literally almost at the end of this. The appendix, was that okay, Chair?
Yes, absolutely. Thank you.
Right, so just very quickly, Event Safety Advisory Group, that takes up some significant time and effort. Obviously, we're getting back to some normality in terms of events, so that's causing an impact to the team. We do advise the likes of the Equestrian Centre in Caldecott, Chepstow Racecourse, Abergavenny Food Festival, Us Show, just to name a few. So that is busy. I think it's time consuming last year because people are thinking, well, what if Welsh Government lift these restrictions and we want to prepare for our annual events. So a lot of time went into things that didn't actually occur. So obviously firework displays didn't happen last year. They have happened 2 weeks ago, but we give a lot of advice for things that didn't actually happen, which is a bit frustrating for both sides, really. So in terms of a summary, Chair and Councillors, 6 gives a summary. So it was about providing that robust response to the pandemic. That was a request from the Health Board and from Welsh Government. So I think we did stand up and provide and continue to provide an excellent track and trace service, which is really assisted by knowing the localities, which we'll touch upon in Appendix 2. But that really had the biggest impact on this financial year. 6.2 obviously explains those traditional proactive visits. Gareth touched on some then, and on Jill's side, particularly food hygiene visits, which is a bedrock of what we do. Those literally didn't happen to the same extent clearly as they would have pre-pandemic, as a direct consequence of dealing with COVID matters. Search requests remained high throughout. Some went up significantly, which was perhaps a bit of a surprise during a pandemic, but I think a stay at home was a big issue for certain elements of the service. So that picks up the general increase in service requests. The joint working has been a real success, and we think about joint working with our professional colleagues, but also internally, I think if we were to do a straw poll of our care homes and headmasters, I think they'd say the response from environmental health particularly has been excellent. They know what they need to do when, and been very much dealing with it on a case-by-case basis to help and assist, as opposed to try and be obstructive in any way and ensure compliance with those Welsh Government regulations. So I think 6.6 is hopefully members can gain some assurance from that our performance is in line with other authorities. So it's not unique to us that the proactive visits have had a major hit for that financial year, and I think we are clearly in contact with those governing bodies to explain the position. So that summarises what we did last year. Just quickly in terms of going forward, it's going to be some time yet until we get back to some normality. There's a backlog to deal with, as you'd expect, a bit like a mini version of the NHS really. So we've currently got 1,000, or we will have by the end of March, over 1,300 food hygiene visits to catch up on. So that's one impact, and clearly the other proactive work that Gareth mentioned just now, plus housing visits, the whole issue about private water supplies, we'd like to get back to them proactively, which is often more time effective than trying to respond to problems. If that makes sense. So the nearer we can get to, the sooner, should I say, get back to a more proactive response to service, that would be really helpful. As I say, predominantly that demand for services is increasing. I think you can see that not just year on year. The table showed us a 5-year trend analysis. As a consequence of those increased pressures on small teams, we have submitted a budget pressure for the next financial year that will have to go through due process. So it's gone through the SLT elements, and no doubt will go through the political process as well. So that's looking for some extra recurring resource for these very services. We always look at collaborative opportunities. I think that dog breeding project that Gareth just referred to is a good example. So when we get back to a more even keel, inevitably environmental health and licensing will also look to be at the fore, if you like, in terms of dealing with things as effectively as we can. Just there in 7.3 we also work very effectively with Grant Police. So for example, the COVID restrictions haven't gone completely. You may be surprised if you go to a pub on a Saturday night, but they do need to have reasonable measures. So we've reminded licensed premises of that this month, and they will be getting night visits from Grant Police in December in the run up to Christmas. So we do expect the trade to take a sensible approach in terms of endeavouring to reduce spread as best they can. So finally then on 7.4, we do continue to deliver those statutory responsibilities. We welcome, and we always do have input from local members in terms of what's happening on the patch. We welcome that, and we're always there to improve those outcomes for both members of the public, local businesses, and indeed visitors. An example of being that if they're in a holiday let somewhere, we'd hope they wouldn't pick up anything Campylobacters and coliforms from swigging the local water. So there's a whole range of issues which hopefully we've picked up throughout this report. So I think members would probably agree in that 45 minutes we do cover an awful lot of stuff that's really important to people. So I'll stop there, Chair. I'll stop presenting that one if that's okay, and I'll hand over to you, Chair. We'll pause there if that's okay. I'll
absolutely.
My screen. So hopefully we're back to talking heads. Thanks.
And before I thank you, somebody's got a camera on which is flashing now. I could see it in the little square. So can you all check your cameras are off, please?
Alan Burkett.
Yes, it is Mr. Burkett. We can see that.
If you could turn your camera off, please, if you're able.
Oh, right. Sorry, I've got my actual physical camera off. Turn off that one.
It was flashing. It wasn't so bad when it was up in the little corner, but no, it was on the main screen. Well, this report, absolutely a wealth of information, a very long report, and you've gone through it in great detail. I mean, it must have amazed you going through it when you reflect back over what's happened and how quickly you've had to respond and adapt. And I think that nearly the last line, penultimate line of 7.4, the profile of our public protection services has never been so buoyant. I think that's absolutely spot on. This is a lot of your service is very visible, isn't it? And you're, as you said earlier, you're the first point of call for all of us when we want to know something, and you've had to sort of hit the ground running with a lot of things. So thank you for that detailed report, both written and on the verbal presentation this morning. It's helped greatly. I'm sure some of the questions I was going to ask have been covered, well covered. So we've got some members who'd like to ask some questions. So we'll go to Paul Jordan first, please, Councillor Jordan.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you for that report. Very interesting. You've obviously been extremely busy over the last 12 months or so. Two questions, if you could answer fairly succinctly. So far as the pandemic response is concerned, if that was presented to you in January of next year, would you do anything next year differently from what you did last year? That's the first question. The second question is, I may have missed it in the report, but you have the ability to prosecute people who are offenders. How many businesses or individuals did you prosecute in the last 12 months, and what generally was the outcome? Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Councillor Jordan. So the first one is a sort of look back, and we are doing that sort of reflection through an Aaron Bevan. So you can imagine through Gwent on an Aaron Bevan footprint, there's 6 track and trace teams. So they are asking that question now, what lessons learned, what we do, because foot and mouth would be a good example, isn't it? You know, what's to say we don't have another significant pandemic, and what would we do differently, which I think is the question. I think we responded very well from a blank piece of paper, pretty much, if you go back to March, April 2020. So I think the governance was set up very quickly. So I attend regional group meetings to ensure we're consistent across the county, and that feeds up. So this morning, for example, there's what we call a Gwent incident management team. So the 6 teams report to that Gwent regional team to escalate any issues back to Welsh Government. Those issues could be the likes of the latest guidance for care homes. There's a lot of info that comes at us from Welsh Government to explain what to do in particular settings. It's got to be consistent, it's got to be safe. So I think the governance has gone well. One thing we have fed back, just for info, is perhaps announcements on a Friday afternoon isn't particularly helpful to the front line, because often the providers, for example, schools, they get information on a Friday afternoon, they've got to try and interpret that. So we're on the back foot then, trying to interpret stuff that comes at us on a Friday. So in terms of lessons learned, I think the other bit for me really is it'd be helpful to co-produce some of this guidance. We've had an inordinate number of SOPs, standard operating procedures. So how would you deal with the workplace outbreak? What do you do in terms of schools guidance? School sports to the nth degree, everything's written down somewhere. So I think a reflection for me would, if we could have co-produced some of this stuff, there's guidance for everything, events. So it would have been helpful, I think, with hindsight, to engage those front lines to say, well, actually, they know about events, they know about pubs and clubs and taxi drivers. Let's co-produce early with the frontline officers to produce guidance that makes sense. So again, you're sometimes on the back foot because the guidance often has some errors in it, which we only find out about on a Friday afternoon and try and implement on a weekend, because things don't stop on a weekend. So I think that's the sort of learning point for me. But on that point, Councillor Jordan, I know that there will be reports specifically on that, lessons learned, regionally as well as nationally. As you know, there will be a public inquiry as to exactly what the response looked like nationally, but I know that there'll be a regional reports that touch on that very point as to what we would have done differently. So hopefully that's part one. In terms of prosecuting offenders, I think we took an approach that supported and encouraged business use as opposed to try and whack them over the head with a stick. We did, from the top of my head, I know that licensing did 6, 7, 8 single figures improvement notices. So where perhaps we had customers in a pub and they seemed to be flouting things, we went with the premises, the designated premises supervisor. So as you're probably aware, the individual offence, if someone's in all these and haven't got a face mask, that'll be a police matter. We deal with the business side of it. So we've dealt with those complaints through the trade to say ensure that your standards are improved. We go back then to ensure things have improved. Generally, I think the compliance in Monmouth has been very good, which is testament to the public being. You hear some terrible stories, and you only got to go to Bristol to see, pretty people have sort of given up the masks and all the rest of it. You could say it's not illegal crimes in Bristol, but they seem pretty high risk, shall we say, in terms of packed pubs, etc. And where we have had blatant breaches, as we'd say, we refer them to Gwent Police. So they're happy to go out on a Saturday night, and as I said earlier, they will be doing Black Friday, etc. next month. They will be out and about in all the main towns based on our advice as to where the problem pubs are. So we will be doing that. But I think generally we haven't really gone for that enforcement approach of serving notices on businesses because that's quite unhelpful. I think they've had a real struggle. Staff have lost their jobs. We tried to work with them as best we can. So it has only been a handful, Councillor Jordan, and hopefully that answers both your questions.
Okay, fine. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for that. Councillor Chahan, Jamie.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Dave, and your team for this report. As the Chair has already said, it's an extensive and informative report. I've got a couple of questions. One touches on the answer on what we've just discussed with prosecutions. It's in relation to those with the PPE and the hand sanitizer that wasn't up to standard. Was there any prosecutions on the suppliers of that hand sanitizer, if you like? And what effect does COVID passports have on the performance of you going forward now that they've come in? I think, if that makes sense. Thank you.
If I start with a sort of general question, PPE and passports, then I'll hand over to Gareth a specific question because he dealt specifically with the hand sanitizer issue. So Gareth can provide an answer to that. So in terms of the PPE and the COVID passports, it's something we've been very keen on in terms of encouraging businesses to comply with that. As I said in response to the last to Councillor Jordan's, I think the compliance has been generally very good. So we haven't had big issues in terms of non-compliance with the PPE requirements. And in terms of the COVID passports, I think every little helps would be a line off a certain supermarket chain. So the likes of Chepstow Racecourse, they'll have, for example, the big Christmas meet now, won't they? So that'll be 8,000 plus people. So that helps in terms of, are you double vaccinated? That gives individual protection and reduces transmission amongst larger crowds. So that can only help. It's difficult. The police have said they're not going to be tackling it from an enforcement perspective. So it is back. The onus is on the businesses. And that, as you know, has recently been announced. I think the last Welsh Government announcement was to extend that to theatres and cinemas. So I think that's only helpful. You tend to have the good, the bad and the ugly. So again, based on local intelligence, we will receive those complaints inevitably. I went somewhere and it was dismissive. No one really looked at my phone to see if I actually was that person for the COVID pass. And then we'd obviously deal with that, both ourselves and Gwent Police, if and when that was a problem in a particular premises in Chepstow, for example, we would act on that and act accordingly. So that's generally how we respond to it. So I think it's helpful. It's not going to be enforced with vigour by the police. They've said that already. But as a bit like my Aldi's example, We would always tackle the business primarily because the police have the enforcement powers for individuals. But I know the hand sanitizer, I'll hand over to Gareth on that one. Thank you. Gareth?
Yes, so with the hand sanitizer, fortunately nobody was manufacturing it in our area other than a couple of breweries that diversified. So we supported them with advice to produce it correctly. The stuff that we found that wasn't up to standard and it was being passed off, what we did there was collate it all back in and make sure that got destroyed. And then all the information, intelligence, etc., was passed back to the Home Authority for where it originated. Because within the profession, we work closely, obviously, across the country. So rather than us all try to deal with it individually, we just collated the information locally, provided statements for them to take action. I'm not completely sure how many prosecutions have taken place, but certainly I can ask the question, see if I can find out a bit more information. And then the other PPE stuff, we again, it was very much business advice approach. We also work closely with the HSE because they were taking a proactive approach to doing spot checks. And again, is a lot of the time it was not maybe hitting the required standards for that PPE. So it was again business advice, and again, thankfully, Monmouthshire businesses are a compliant lot on the main, and listened to the advice and reacted. And similarly, picking up on the points with our we do a 3-weekly return for Welsh Government on numbers, and just to confirm what Dave said, in total we've had 22 improvement notices, but that's right across public protection. So we've had 9 in hospitality, 6 in food retail, 1 in non-food retail, and 6 in close personal contact services, mainly barbers and hairdressers.
Okay, thank you. I would be interested in the numbers of prosecution with regards to hand sanitizer, because quite frankly, somebody trying to take advantage of taxi drivers or anybody who needed hand sanitizer, I think is pretty despicable. So if we could get numbers of prosecutions, that would be great, please. Thank you.
Okay, certainly.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Jamie. Before I see if any other members would like to ask some questions, I'd like to ask a question about the street licensing, because this is obviously the way forward for a lot of businesses now. They've all had to change. Oh, Councillor Harris, okay, there is a raised hand for speak now in the chat bar, but I'll invite you in a moment, Councillor Harris. That's fine. No, the street licensing, I mean, that's along with the many challenges you've been looking at throughout this period. We now enjoy sitting outside. People want to do more of that, and I know up until March you were working with highways on that, but if you could just explain to me now what the future is going to be for that, because I understand there's been some changes as to who's going to look after the street licensing. So that's one of my questions, and I think that's something that we really need to look at, in the future. Fly tipping is another big concern. I mean, you've mentioned that people are prosecuted, but obviously it's been very difficult for you to carry out some of these measures during the pandemic, when you've had all this extra work to do. I just wondered if we could perhaps put some emphasis on that for the future. That would be my thoughts on that. And with the track and trace, I understand that some of the track and trace is organised by the Health Authority, or did you do all of it, the whole Monmouthshire for the Health Authority? And having been on the other end of that service, it was absolutely fantastic. Both my husband and I had the wonderful contacts. We were fully informed, kept up to date all along, and it was my own personal experience. And I haven't heard anybody say anything different about that. Everybody's I've spoken to who's been in the same situation has appreciated that very important service. So those are a few questions. If you could answer those, and I'll invite Councillor Harrison. Thank you.
Thanks, Chair. Yeah, in terms of street licenses, I think that is still being discussed. I think grants were issued. I'm thinking Cross Streets, Abergavenny, those pods, and it is street furniture. I think it's part grant funded and specific to those premises. And I think that's been worked through currently. So I know Lee Beach has been working with Highways colleagues. I'm not quite sure, but I will go back with that specific question as to what the longevity is of that. I think there is an appetite, isn't there, to extend that. I think people really enjoyed it. So I'll get back to you specifically on that. I know they had a recent meeting as to street payment licenses, etc. So some of it's national, some of it is through the grants process. So I'll get back to you specifically on that question. The fly tipping, we've had 2 successful prosecutions recently, probably from a year ago. It's just obviously the court system itself has been really clogged up, so that really sends a strong message out. But I totally endorse your view. It's something that public really don't want to see. Businesses don't like to see it today. It's the detriment to the county and visitors. Nothing worse. So something we will endeavour to get back to, if you like, in terms of getting the evidence together. Often difficult. It tends to be a transit van at 3 o'clock in the morning. You know, if you've got any sense, you're not going to do it at 2 o'clock on a Friday afternoon, are you? So it is something that we wholeheartedly would like to do more with our waste colleagues. And then track and trace, it's predominantly provided by Monmouthshire County Council. We have contracted staff that work within our terms and conditions. We do with all community transmissions, which is 90% plus of it. The health board are dealing with inpatients. So someone comes in, either they come in with COVID or they contract it whilst in Neville Hall, for example. They're responsible for their own staff and inpatients. So, but that's minimal. Just for info, we're probably dealing with 80 cases a day currently, so it hasn't gone away. Major impact, a lot of them are school kids, so we've got to work with schools to try and minimise that spread. But no, and I'll feed that back, Councillor Wood. It's always good to get you had a positive experience of if you're an Abergavenny resident, that would have been tracked and traced from members of the Monmouthshire TTP team provided by the authority. So that's good to hear. Thank you.
Good, thank you very much. Right, I'll invite Councillor Harrison now.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Morning, David. Thanks for an absolutely comprehensive report under extremely trying circumstances, and why you haven't gone completely white in your head of hair, I really do not know. It's, along with your summary, makes us receiving this or report a real pleasure, and I mean that sincerely. It answers all the questions that I need to ask. In fact, I don't need to ask them because you've answered it within the report, and all I can say is congratulations to you and your department for what you've done over the last 18 months, because it's above and beyond. So thank you.
No, I really appreciate that. Thanks, Councillor Harris, and through the chair, I'll certainly feed that back to the front line. It's just great to hear that, and it has been a heck of a thing. And people, that bit that Councillor Harris referred to, over and above the call of duty, we've had to have people work on weekends and evenings. We're not the type of officers that put the phone down. It's 5:30. I think I'll log off. We have literally had people working till 10, 11 o'clock on a Sunday night. So to track and trace and control the spread of COVID. So it's hard to articulate that all in reports, but just to be assured that you know, across the team, it's been a heck of an effort. I'm very proud of the front line, and I'll comment back that members endorse that view. That's really helpful. The final bit for me, I know I think we've got another question, would be just to pick up that COVID response. But I know, conscious of time, Chair, I know there's a couple more questions on the annual report, but we'll skip through that within about 10 minutes, the Appendix 2, if that's okay. But I think you've got another question. Thank you. Yes, Councillor Edwards.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you to both officers for their presentation and report this morning. Looking at the report, section 5 under Pest Control, and I've also got a question on the air quality as well. But first of all, the Pest Control, and you mentioned about the increase in number of complaints. Is that anything to do with the serving of food outside and the street licensing that was mentioned earlier on, or perhaps even the increased use of business premises offering takeaway food during the pandemic? Or are there any other factors involved in that?
Yeah, thanks, Councillor Edwards. I think it's probably more to do with people being at home. Most of our complaints won't be business to business, it'll be members of the public, and I think predominantly it'll be the fact they were sat at home looking out the window on their laptops and the rat bounces by. I think it's probably that simple, not being dismissive at all. I don't, probably in terms of the food waste, that reduced because the lockdown December through to March was a complete lockdown, no food businesses were open. So I think that would probably expect, in terms of that commercial setting and rat and mice infestations, you'd expect it for a third of the year, you'd have a drop in numbers. So I think that drop has been more than compensated for by the fact that I think it's literally, and that would explain the statutory nuisance complaints going up as well. Things haven't changed fundamentally. We haven't had an influx of major businesses, etc. I think it's the predominant factor there is more people being at home, being irritated by noise. Oh, I can hear tractors thumping in the background. A mouse has run past, and I think they pick up the phone and contact the council. So I think that's predominant reason for the increase in pest control numbers.
Thank you, David, for that clarification. And my second question is on air quality. And that last paragraph where you mentioned about the air quality sensors in the 4 schools, Usk, St Mary's, Chepstow and Monmouth. With that last sentence, when you mentioned the data collected and the scope for this to be an important education tool, is that something that's being taken forward at the moment, or is it just simply an idea?
No, it's yeah, good question. It's something we're certainly keen and anxious to engage with the schools, because it's live recordings. It gives you, rather than predominantly, this is what happened last month, which isn't particularly helpful, asthmatics, etc. And the reason we targeted those schools, Monmouth and Chepstow, so you got some major trunk roads nearby, particularly Monmouth. You got the A40 trundling through, haven't you? So that's why those were particularly targeted with the cooperation of the schools. But yeah, we see it as an educational tool. The reason that hasn't happened to date really is because they've been so entrenched with the COVID response as to trying to keep their classes open as best they can. We had that whole bubble process of classes being sent home because they had a couple of COVID cases within that setting. So I think against that backdrop, it's taking schools a bit of time to get back to normality. But to answer your question, I think when we set them up and targeted particular schools, that was very much the forefront, is how does it become educational? How does it become something more useful? If you're asthmatic, it'd be quite nice to know that actually today, probably best to shut the windows. We've got a bit of a pollution problem outside. And we feel that because it's quite, I'm no scientist, but I understand the data is pretty good and it'd be a good educational tool for a number of reasons. So that's certainly the intention. It just hasn't happened over the last 18 months because schools have been preoccupied with their core activities and curriculum. So I think, but that's certainly something they want to advance. Yes.
Thanks, David.
Thanks.
Okay, thank you very much for that. Okay, so we'll move on to the what do you want to tell us about the COVID response? I think
Appendix 2. We won't. It's shorter than the annual report, so I'll just share the screen on that. The COVID-related response, which is Appendix 2. So hopefully, Chair, you can see that.
Yes, indeed.
Yeah. Okay, so like I say, this is shorter and we won't linger on each box. We'll go through it in a fairly timely fashion. So this is Jill's team, Environmental Health Commercial. So they're the ones predominantly do all those proactive visits, food safety visits, health and safety, communicable disease, etc. And how was their work affected by that? I think we picked up in the main report that clearly they had a complete shift from being proactive to reactive, and lots of complaints about social distancing and premises potentially lock-ins in pubs. So working with licensing and the police, we were very reactive into dealing with those sorts of issues during the pandemic. So this is focusing, the first column is very much focusing on what we've done as a consequence. The contact tracing has been the biggest impacts on this team, because, as I said, in response to your question, I think, Chair, we had to set that up from scratch last, I think Monmouthshire were the first to do a trace on the 1st of June 2020, so that was an historic moment, and we've been doing it ever since. The numbers have fluctuated to up to 120 cases in a single day, so we've had to track those individuals and provide a service as best we can. So that's been the big impact across this team, and I think that's articulated in the second line there. I mentioned 84-hour service. We scale that down slightly by 7 hours a week, but you can imagine it takes some logistics to provide a 77-hour-a-week service, 7 days a week. So that's been extremely challenging. And just to put that into context, some of the numbers earlier, where you got 5 or 6 officers in Jill's team, 2 were full-time just in the care homes. There's that number of queries in terms of admissions, in terms of segregating as best we can in terms of cases, put them into incident. There's a whole process involved with health board colleagues, testing regimes. Those have been hugely onerous bits of work that have taken them off what they normally do. So the main impact clearly has been contact tracing. We're involved with key worker accommodation. There's certain exemptions. So when people couldn't go on holiday, for example, obviously if you're working on an electrification of a train line, or even sex education was a series that's recorded. Lots of it's on location Llandogo way for fans of that show. I think it's on Netflix. They were exempt, so when they were filming through a pandemic, we had to approve accommodation to ensure that was done in a safe manner. So that was accommodation. Legionella I mentioned earlier. Obviously, as businesses came out of being shut, we had to ensure the water safety and work with businesses to ensure that. Business grants, we worked to ensure they were legitimate, to ensure these businesses were as per our records. Care homes has been a huge time-consuming task for us, but it's the right thing to do, clearly, in terms of our most vulnerable members of society. So that was the right thing to do. Contact those care home providers, commissioning team, liaison back with health colleagues, and also we've got the likes of Llanarth Court, the Derryn House in Penllyn, etc. So all sorts of settings that have been quite time consuming and taking a lot of time with the teams. Diversification of businesses, I touched upon that earlier. When we went through those different stages of lockdown, then we had to respond accordingly and give them advice. So then there's a quick snapshot of a 6-month snapshot pre-pandemic, first column. The start of the pandemic, so that's April to September last year, and then a comparison with April, September this year, so that's up to the end of this September. So it's quite interesting to see how the food visits have dropped. The health, safety and welfare has been fairly consistent. The COVID, as you expect, and these are requests as opposed to the track and trace element. They've obviously steadied from the peak of last year, if you like, so you'd expect them to be substantial. Events and tends, again, the reason that's gone up in the last 6 months is clearly from the 1st of August, alert level 0 kicked in, and that's meant that events can resume. So that's why that's doubled in comparison to the previous month. But then interestingly, if you look at pre-pandemic, it gives you an idea of the bulk of work that's typical when we're out of a COVID incident. So that gives you an idea. So that's the number on the bottom is fairly stable, but all things been changed by the COVID response. So a little bit of narrative there in terms of that effect on the team. I think we probably covered that now, Chair. I think I mentioned at its peak we had 87 staff dealing with track and trace, and the feedback not only from professional partners but also the public has been excellent. So I think that's perhaps another reflection is I think we need to perhaps get some quotes in for next year we had dealings with the service, and that, you know, we felt reassured. We were grateful for receipt of that service. I was concerned about my elderly relative. I think we probably need to capture some of those stories and good news stories that they do occur. And I think probably with this core of staff, they see it as it's what we do. So they're not sort of backpacking types. They sort of not as in backpackers, patting their back in celebration. They tend to be very much let's get on with it individuals. So I think that's why we don't perhaps bang our drum as best we should. And I think a reflection perhaps is that we need to put some of those personal stories in to emphasise the good work that is done. We've got a note there of the total number of service requests, which I think has been reflected in the main report. So that's sort of the commercial team. Very quickly on the public health team led by Hugh. Again, I thought it'd be useful to compare periods of time, pre-pandemic, the start, and currently, if you like, the more recent thing. Those noise complaints, it's a bit like my response on the pest control element. It would seem that more people being at home increases your statutory nuisance complaints. The smoke nuisance one's interesting. I think it's because people weren't allowed, if you remember in that particular period in the middle there, the 113, your civic amenity sites were shut. So they think, well, I tell you what, I'll set fire to all my garden trash in the back garden. So that caused a whole load of complaints when people weren't allowed to get into civic amenity sites. Fly tipping has been stable. Well, in fact, it hasn't been stable. It's doubled, isn't it, from 2 years ago over that period of time. So it's something, as you referred to, Chair, something we certainly need to get back to. I'll be vigilant as we can in terms of getting evidence together to crack down on fly tipping. Rats and mice, I think I explained that one earlier. So yeah, so it's gone up quite significantly, 20% top med in terms of pre-pandemic, and fairly stable from what we saw at the start of the pandemic. So that gives an overview there. So some comments there as to where the team are going forward. Public space protection orders, this is something that's put on the back burner. Members of this committee may be familiar with Hugh presenting aspects of that in terms of dog control, dogs on leads, you know, what control measures do you want in our public spaces? I'm not going to go through that now because Hugh will be back at this committee early next year. So he'll have the responses back from those that public consultation, which this committee agreed some time back. But you'll note there they've had 1,300 survey responses, so that's something that they're going to have to plough through because it's not necessarily yes/no type response. So again, we're going to go through those in some detail and report back to this committee specifically on that. So there's nothing else on that one. Licensing then, led by Linda. Councillor Trahan will be familiar with the work, being the chair of this the Licensing Regulatory Committee. So I think we just really switched to providing that help and support to businesses that are probably struggling through a very difficult time. And that's outlined in the narrative there. The hospitality sector dealt with significant change, which I picked up in the previous report. When the regulations changed literally by the month, that was quite a difficult one to manage and relay back. And I think that's in the hospitality sector, 3 legislative changes since April. That whole issue about opening outdoors, dealing with working with highways for those payment licenses, and noise and live music, those changed as well as to what's permitted. Obviously, you know, it's a respiratory viral spread, so probably not a good idea to have someone bellowing within 5 yards of someone else if they're singing and dancing and all those issues that could cause viral spread. So that was there. As I said, alert level 0 kicked in August. That hasn't stopped things in terms of licence trade. They still need to implement reasonable measures, limit numbers preferably, so we haven't got a cohort of people that are particularly vulnerable in terms of spread. So that's basically, I think, the licensing one. particular work with the taxi trade in terms of segregation between them and the passengers, wiping down of surfaces. We did provide hand sanitation. Major Brewery and another local premises provided for free. So at the peak of the pandemic, it's really helpful that local businesses stepped up and said, we'll provide it. So through those channels, we provided an outlet in Abergavenny, for example, where taxi drivers could come up and pick up sanitizer for free because they were getting through it, noting that they were sanitizing vehicles between passengers. And that again is a comparison of the figures, which again shows some stability, some relative stability, but it's a different type of service request. In the first line, the COVID request went from 0 obviously up to 100 odd. Those routine inspections. So I think the story is much the same, isn't it? That we've had to respond. So as a consequence of that, routine inspections have reduced significantly. Is the news there? I'll hand over to Gareth in terms of the final section there, Chair, if that's okay. Gareth?
Yeah. Good. There we are. Yeah, just picking up on the trading standards and health aspect there. You see from the figures, there was a considerable increase in the 6 months last year, as you'd expect. It's still increased on 2 years ago this year, but it has died back a little bit. But that's mainly because from a legislation perspective with the COVID changes, it's calmed down a little bit, and we've been having longer periods without changes. Certainly in the first 6 months last year, as Dave referred earlier, the number of changes that were coming in on a very regular basis. And I think that the biggest impact on the team was not just the number of inquiries, but actually being able to get and understand it themselves. Because again, the updates, we'd be told on a Friday, maybe given a heads up on a Thursday lunchtime if the First Minister was in an interview. But we didn't literally see anything until it was produced, and I think that was the biggest problem. Very early on, there was an awful lot of to and fro-in. There was a group set up across all local authorities, everybody could feed in, because we're well used to, within public protection, being told by businesses, oh, the colleagues in that authority or that, they told us different, or they do it differently. So we were quite keen to make sure that we were consistent across the whole of Wales. But that is very difficult when you don't get the heads up for guidance and legislation in advance. And also, not being critical of Welsh Government, because again, the lawyers were up against it, having to draft the legislation, and they were doing it from a legal perspective, not from a practical on the ground perspective. So the enforceability issue was significant as well. So I think that's one of the biggest things that we needed to take away from all this, and certainly, hopefully, Welsh Government will learn lessons from. There's a little bit there around the continuing service that we did, the protection. Obviously, we've touched on the scams already, PPE. I mentioned the increase with business advice, with people looking to diversify and do things differently. But also then the aspects of the service that did carry on going. We couldn't turn blind eyes to other criminality. As vital as it was to respond to COVID, everything else was still continuing. And I did reference last year in the report the one of the prosecutions and the seizures that we had to take place. So I'll come to that in a minute. So there's a few items there around examples of COVID related scams. We ourselves experienced about 46, a mixture of email, post scams, mobile scams, telephone scams, etc. The animal health and welfare part there, referenced last year the prosecution where we seized 128 cattle. Touching on Councillor Treharne's question earlier about prosecutions, and I did forget that one of the examples here with this prosecution was the fact that it was taken to court, or the informations were laid fairly promptly, but it took a best part of 12 months to actually for the case to be heard. And similarly, with 2 cases that we've currently got in the pipeline within Trading Standards and Animal Health, informations have been laid in June, July, and only one of them is currently beginning a court date, and we're still waiting to hear about the other one. And I suspect that's the situation with regards to a lot of the PPE related prosecutions that hopefully will follow. That at the moment they are stuck sort of cut caught in the court system. So yeah, just the feedback on that prosecution as a result after we'd had those cattle signed over. We successfully were able to sell those cattle after they'd been looked after to cover the authorities' costs. And then during the trial, guilty pleas were entered by the defendant against 12 charges, and he was sentenced to 12 weeks imprisonment. It was sentenced for 2 years, and again a disqualification there for holding cattle. We did look at all animals, but to be fair, the other animals he was looking after, sheep mainly, were in a good state. So we didn't think it was right to push for that, and I think the court would have agreed with that. There's a little bit there about unlicensed dog breeder that we had in Monmouthshire, and again, thankfully, the owner decided to sign over those puppies as part of a pre-trial agreement, and again, with that circumstance, we weren't talking about the organised crime element that the breeding project is looking at. This is just sort of general, somebody who's got their dog, but they are deliberately sort of breeding for profit. And again, I just end there was touching on the dog breeding project that we lead in, but it's very much across Trading Standards Wales as a whole. A fortnight ago, the Animal Welfare Plan for Wales was launched, and that's again the programme for government commitments this in the coming for 4.5 years now, where they're looking to build on that model. So the dog breeding project has already evolved into the local authority enforcement project. And what they're looking to do then is expand out into the other areas of animal licensing, which again is very much sort of taken a back seat with regards to welfare, where austerity cuts have had an impact over the years. Hopefully, again, this is the start of rebuilding the profession. One of the commitments is to sort of raise the professional status of animal health officers to recognise that. Because currently, whilst it's a statutory duty for animal health and welfare, there isn't actually a statutory requirement for officers to have any form of qualification or experience or anything. And again, this is something that we really need to build into it. But I'll leave it there.
Fine, that's fine. Thank you very much indeed, both. We're going to have a couple more questions, and then I'll sum up. So Councillor Powell and then Councillor Treharne.
Thank you, Chairman. Actually, I've just developed another question while listening to that. The first one was because of all the businesses, a lot of businesses having to lock down and restart. How have the numbers of businesses that have restarted and got going again? Have you any idea the percentage or sort of numbers that have managed to get going again and haven't gone away completely? I mean, obviously some haven't been able to start up because they haven't been able to afford to. That's the one question. And the other question is really about the dogs that we're just talking about. So many people have been buying dogs at exorbitant prices because they're on their own at home. And when people go back to work, they're going to say, oh, this dog's a bother now. And is there going to be a problem with dogs being abandoned because people don't want them anymore? So that's the two questions, the businesses and the dogs. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Councillor Powell. I'll pick up the first, and then Gareth will pick up the second element. So the first one, it's in table 1. I'm just looking at number of new businesses opened, and we had 101. So generally, when I said we had 13 outstanding, there'll be some double if they go on an annual one. They haven't had anything for 18 months. I think it's about 1,200 food businesses out there. So it's running about 10%. So, and some of those will be pub would be typically closed down. It's been taken over by a new proprietor.
Yeah.
So when they are starting from scratch, that does become a lot more onerous. Again, just picking up Gareth's point really about professionalism. We are pushing as a profession to get, have a license process for food businesses. So you do need to register. There's nothing stopping someone having a redundancy check and, setting up a food business.
Yeah.
Which I think is Gareth's point on the animal health front, really, is something we're very conscious of. But, 100 new ones in 12 months is quite significant. Because sometimes they got no understanding. So you really are starting from ground zero in terms of trying to give them some advice on temperature control, segregation, cross-contamination of meat products, dairy products. It can be quite an onerous task, but that gives you an idea of numbers. I'll hand over to Gareth with the dog question. Thanks.
Cool.
Yes, I think it's it's certainly a considerable, a big concern, shall we say. I know that a lot of the charities have voiced it, and they've raised it with Welsh Government. As part of the project, we've fed back to Welsh Government. From our perspective, it's difficult because obviously we haven't got the responsibility from that perspective. But we do have the stray dog contract, which effectively, ultimately could result in increased number of stray dogs or something, which would have an impact. And from our perspective, the wider part of the project, Operation Scout recently did a raid on one of the premises involved with organised crime. It was down in Carmarthen, but as a result of that, there was over 240 dogs taken. And again, where do you keep them? We had the speakers of these in the 128 cattle from an animal welfare perspective. Yes. And the costs there were considerable. The value of the animals were £45,000 at the time. Thankfully, that increased to 60-odd thousand because the upkeep over a 5-month period was around £30-odd thousand. It was a huge amount. And whilst dogs are slightly different, the volume potentially would be incredible. So it's something we've picked up with Welsh Government and raised on behalf of the charity as well to try and get some support, but I'm not sure that anyone's got the answer at the moment.
No, I sponsor 4 dogs with the Dogs Trust because our last dog, when he died, we thought perhaps at our age we wouldn't have another one, and so I sponsor 4 with Dogs Trust. I know they're overwhelmed with dogs coming in, but what makes it so very sad is with that other end of it, especially where my daughter farms out in the country, is this spate of people stealing dogs. Somebody just had gone out up the road for 5 minutes, came back, and they'd lost 2 of their dogs, and they're quite concerned about that. So you've got 2 sides of it. You've got the people with the dogs they don't want, and then you've got other people stealing them to make money out of them, and it is quite a concern.
What we're trying to do with the project as well is to make these links, because obviously, yes, there was a government task force around the thefts, and they are talking about a national dog registration system. I know years ago there used to be a dog license requirement for anybody.
Oh, yes. Yeah.
The project started from the perspective of illegal breeding, and that currently commercial licensed breeders had to hit certain criteria to require a license. The definition doesn't help because you're talking about having at least 2 breeding bitches and at least 2 litters of puppy in a 12-month period. Even trying to enforce that is a nightmare. Legitimate businesses obviously come forward, they get the licenses, but those that don't, or those that don't hit criteria or find ways around it, creates the problem. So what we're looking to do with the project is put forward a proposed model for Wales where that no puppy can be sold without some form of registration or licensing. They might not be a commercial license, but they still need to register. And if there are exemptions for show breeders or working dogs, even those need to register. And really that's the only way you're going to tighten up to the sense that being able to prove that somebody is doing it illegally. And also tying in with that is the microchipping, because again, that's it's a legal requirement. Not everybody has gone down that route. It's not really enforceable, but if we can create a central system which allows the different databases to be collated, then it's an easy check for both the police and enforcement officers.
Yes, thank you very much.
Thank you, Gareth. I'm conscious we've got Councillor Trahan to come in quickly, but I'm conscious of the time. But Gillian Dickin, you've been having some problems, haven't you, with your internet, and you've got your hand raised. So can I bring you in quickly in case it's something you want to refer to that's been said and you weren't able to come in before?
Hello, yes, so sorry about that. Yeah, it's been a major outage in the area, but it was just to supplement what Dave said, that actually the numbers of businesses that have opened have actually increased since the report. So we're actually standing now at over 170. So and there we have our programme for returning and to doing inspections. We're obviously prioritising those at high risk. So we are going through every one of them, making sure that we're picking out the ones at high risk. And I'm sorry if you said this already, Dave, but that's what we're doing, as well as the high risk inspections that we're already programmed to do. As for the businesses we don't know that have closed, we won't know they've closed until we've actually gone round to these premises, because although there's a duty on a food business operator to inform us of any changes in their business within 28 days, it's obviously not the first thing on their mind to do when they close down. So we won't know the numbers of premises that have closed or changed, but we do know the numbers that are opening up, and new businesses that we need to get out there and risk rate and get inspected. So that's currently stands at just over 170 at the moment. That's all I wanted to add. Thank you.
That's very helpful. Thank you very much for that. Right, Jamie, Councillor Trahan.
Thank you, Chair. Dave, if it's possible, can we have the licensing aspect of this report brought to licensing committee, please? Because I think it might be interesting for them to gauge what's been going on. And just a general question: if I was to seek employment in the food industry, I would need a food hygiene certificate. So do MCC provide that training, or is it a private business? Thank you.
Shall I bring in Jill? Do you want to come in a food businesses specific question?
Yes. Well, my team do provide food hygiene training, but to be honest, that's gone by the board at the moment, because we've got to prioritise and concentrate on inspections and getting back into the resolving that, the backlog basically. So we won't be doing that for a long time, because we've got so much work to pick up on. There is another body within MCC that does provide training that I understand, and we're hoping to link in with them. But at the moment, we don't do it within our team, but I know that MCC do it elsewhere, and that's who we're hoping to link in with, because obviously when we go inspections, we want to be able to tell them this is a good place to go and get your training for food hygiene.
Okay, thank you.
Right. Okay. Well, thank you very much indeed for all the information you've given us this morning. What I will say is that what's been obvious, the pandemic has placed a lot of significant additional pressure on your service, the Public Protection Service, which was already stretched pre-pandemic. So this report has enabled us to draw on interesting comparison of their activity pre-pandemic. You put a lot of information, a lot of different tables, pre-pandemic and during the pandemic. It's very wide-ranging, environmental health, trading standards, animal health and licensing. So we've heard how lockdowns led to a rise in environmental health complaints, ranging from noise and disturbance, fly tipping, bonfires, dog fouling. And it was due to more people being in their homes and also greater public visibility when these incidents occurred. You've actually explained that in great detail. You've also had to deal with a normal day job, undertaking proactive visits to establishments to protect the public from poor hygiene, as well as support businesses during the pandemic. We heard there are particular resource issues in the animal health due to a shortage of staff and additional work, such as the dog breeding programme. We've heard a lot of information about all that this morning, thank you, which is a partnership piece of work that Monmouthshire is leading on. Our scrutiny today has led us to conclude that the Public Protection Service has performed incredibly well over the pandemic, particularly the environmental health team, which needed and did establish a 24 hours a day, 7 days a week track and trace. And we've heard the figures and the amount of work that has involved, as well as all the other responsibilities. So We acknowledge that delivering this additional service has been very onerous, and it's been very important that you were relaying the correct information, which you did at all times, kept yourselves up to date. And we do support you, I'm sure, in raising these resource issues with the Cabinet. But I would really like to extend our thanks to you all and all the team for everything that you do. You keep us all safe, and we do appreciate that. You carried out some extremely difficult work during unprecedented times. We've heard a lot about what's happened during the pandemic with all the services in the council, and you've also, done things extremely well, and we're very, very grateful for that. So thank you for your time and for presenting this report today. And I appreciate the amount of information you tried to give us in a short space of time, but I'm sure we're all fully up to date now with everything, and wish you well for the future. Thank you very much.
Yeah,
Right.
thanks to the officers from Valsmith as well.
Here we are.
Thank you.
Yeah. So thanks, Chair and Councillors. We'll certainly relay that to the front line, and it's good to hear, and we appreciate that. And thanks for enduring us. We're an hour and 40 minutes, I think. So hopefully it's a good use of your time, and it's certainly good use of our time. And we'll feed that back to the front line, which is where the delivery occurs. Great. Many thanks. We'll leave now, if that's okay.
Yes, indeed. Thank you very much once again.
Thanks, Chair.
Thank you.
Bye now.
I think that was time really well spent, Chairman.
Good, good. I
Yeah.
think so. It's very difficult to try and get things over in great detail like that. So it did take some time, but I think it was time well spent, as Mr. Jones just said. So we'll give a minute to draw breath for our next report. Right, we've got the Strategic Equality Plan, Scrutiny of the Annual Monitoring Report. I'm sorry we've kept you waiting, Mr. Burkett. You've been very patient, but I'm sure you probably appreciated all that we were listening to. Is very much you're involved in it anyway, so you know what's going on. But it's always useful to review things, isn't it?
Oh yeah, I mean the work that's gone on there is fantastic. So it was well worth listening to. Or
Right.
maybe I'll get sore throat after that, I think.
Yeah, I think he deserves. They all deserve a cup of coffee now.
That's right, yeah. Well, thanks so much. For those who don't know me, I'm Alan Burkett. I'm a Equalities and Welsh Language Officer for Monmouthshire County Council. And it's my pleasure, or otherwise, to just report to you something we've got to do on an annual basis. So I won't show you the document because it's just one of our sort of, well, it's not an ordinary document, but it's a pretty boring document to look at. It's probably more interesting to read. But I'll just run through some issues within it that I've picked up. So the Equality Act of 2010 means that we have to have in place a strategic equality plan, and with it we've got strategic objectives. We're currently on the third one, which is in place until 2024, and annually we got to report on our sort of intentions of what we want to do, and then obviously our action plan to see where we are with that. So essentially, and there's loads of other information in there as well in terms of the makeup of our staff, gender equality, people, the technical categories of people applying for jobs, people successful in applying for jobs, people unsuccessful, people having undertaken training, people having undertaken things such as discipline and grievance, etc. So it's quite there's a lot within it that are required by the Equality Act and the regulations that we sort of comply with. So this is our third strategic equality plan, and it's the third one, the fourth one I've written in total. So I did one for Blind and Gwent when I worked there, and I think this is my 10th or 9th or 10th annual monitoring report. So it's something I'm used to doing. Just to give it a little bit of context, it links with a number of other sort of strategies that we have to consider when we're doing this piece of work. So the social justice strategy, obviously the social justice strategy that we've come in with as a local authority, the Welsh Language Wales measure, Cymraeg 2050, which is 1 million Welsh speakers by 2050, the More Than Words strategy, from Welsh Government, which is to do with language choice for Welsh speakers when they receive care. The Local Development Plan, Strategy for Older People, our Wellbeing Plan, Wellbeing Future Generations Act, and Social Care and Wellbeing Act, Wales, 2014. So you can see there's a lot sort of underpins this. Sorry, my wife's working from home as well. It's not easy trying to do all this in the house. So our strategic objectives for this particular period, 2020-24, and I just listen to you: giving children the best possible start in life and overcoming barriers to attainment and opportunity. And I'm sure you'll agree with that. Overcoming inequalities and access to economic prosperity. Creating cohesive communities. Providing, sorry, bear with me a second, folks. Sorry, folks, this is one of the perils of working remote. Wife's a social worker, and she just had a phone call now. She's just tested on a lateral flow test, positive for COVID. So she's just been for a test now. She's trying to explain to a colleague what's happening. So please accept my apologies on that. Going back to the document then. Right. Creating a diverse and inclusive workforce. Sorry, beg your pardon. Right, I'm back. Provide services accessible to our public and support our workforce. Create a diverse and inclusive workforce and reducing the gender pay gap. Just scrolling down. So what I'll just, underneath those strategic objectives, I want to pick out a desired outcome and the action put in place and perhaps the progress as well, and a couple of bits of good practice if that is okay with you all. So the desired outcome: children, young people and families are supported to improve their well-being. So the action of that was develop an integrated early intervention and prevention pathway, which supports children and families at the earliest opportunity and reduces the need for statutory intervention to keep people safe from those suffering from adverse childhood experiences, so ACEs, I think they're called. Now that's actually been completed, so that's really good, and that's obviously done in a very short space of time. Considering the pandemic, I think it's quite exceptional how many of these things have been progressed to such an extent that some of them are finished, some of them are well on their way to being achieved. So I think that's because all of these are done by officers of the council, they're not done by myself specifically. One example of good practice: giving young people a voice. And the action was running a leadership scheme. So the main objective of the leadership scheme was to provide young children with the opportunity to grow their confidence. So inspiring young children at a young age, encouraging them to present their ideas and sharing those with their peers to create impact. Through the pandemic, there were a number of meetings held with Year 6 ambassadors to share their good practice and create new ideas with others. As far as I know, that is still continuing. Hopefully, as the pandemic eases, then it'll be sort of face-to-face contact. The next strategic objective: overcoming inequalities and access to economic prosperity. Desired outcome: people having the opportunity to raise their household income. So the action there: delivering the Communities for Work programme. I think that's with Hannah Jones and her team. Reducing the number of people in or at risk of poverty. This programme will be in place by March 2022. So you can see with some of these, COVID has sort of delayed the start of them. Another one then is more people with disabilities and care leavers in employment. An action there is provide access to the labour market for people with disabilities and care leavers. So the progress on this one was people with disabilities and care leavers are part of the guaranteed interview process. And this was implemented, I think, passed by council on the 3rd of March 2020. I mean, I think it's quite stark, the figures with disabled people. I think in Monmouthshire, we got 25 to 30% of people within Monmouthshire, an ageing population in Monmouthshire, are classified as disabled or having disabilities. And it's recognised that 40% of people who are registered disabled are in poverty. So there's a distinct link there. and a very sad link, obviously, for them. Very briefly, creating cohesive communities was another strategic objective. And this is a group that we've got, a bullying inclusion group that I've been chairing, along with Richard Austin and Emma Taylor from CYP. It's recognised that there are issues of bullying within Monmouthshire and in society as a whole, and across all schools in the whole of Wales and the UK and probably across the whole world. So it's not an issue that is particular to us, but it's obviously something we wanted to work on and address. And it's about having better, so the desired outcome was having better data available about hate-based bullying. And the action was to improve recording of incidents of hate-based bullying and piloting appropriate interventions. Any of you that have any sort of knowledge of the bullying sort of scene, so to speak, it's a very difficult one. I think these days a lot of bullying is online. It can be quite insidious. It obviously has massive impacts on those being bullied. And also we got issues regarding the consistency of data that's collected. So some schools are very forward in what they tell you what's going on. Others then see it as potentially a problem. If they say they've got a problem with bullying, they've got a problem with bullying, and it may prohibit parents from sending their children to those schools. You know, I think how you view that is obviously a personal thing, but we're trying to get a consistent approach to this in order that we can then really address those issues and pinpoint any actions needed to try and address those, whether in particular schools, or it may be a Monmouthshire-wide issue, or it could be a cluster issue. So it's been a really interesting piece of work, which is progressing very well. And the key to this now is we're involving schools with that, because we can't decide for them what their issues are. They need to be talking with us, and we can have a joint sort of work program on this. Piece of good practice within this particular area this other area is the Girl and Boy project. So the action being the youth team, headed up by Josh Klein, to provide support to groups of young people on specific areas of well-being. Progress with this, the youth service offer a Girl and Boy project, and it's targeted group that offers support for groups of young people to discuss topics such as sexual health, social anxiety, social issues, and other issues that are affecting the well-being. I think probably some of this stuff has been exacerbated by the pandemic and the lockdowns, with people with anxiety issues. You know, so the lockdown has exacerbated this, and they're not having that sort of face-to-face contact to try and get over some of these anxieties. So this is a really good piece of work being carried out by our youth services team. Rushing through this because I realise we're nearly 2 hours into this meeting now. So strategic objective 4, provide services that are accessible to our public and support our workforce. But one I've picked out here is the new desired outcome was the new and improved face-to-face access to council services. And the one I picked up was the new community hub in Abergavenny, which I think has been a significant improvement, and it's been a big success. So a new hub in Abergavenny opened the 14th of September 2020, and we also continue to run the UK's only local authority run post office, and this vital service for the residents of Westfield. So there's a mixture there of something we've sort of instigated ourselves, and obviously a new piece of work we've carried out on the hub in Abergavenny. Again, something probably exacerbated by the pandemic, and the outcome is improved services for dealing with mental health in Monmouthshire. And we work closely with Mind, and it's something we're looking in terms of our workforce. And what I picked on is improving support for workforce mental health. Again, I've worked from home since my birthday 18 months ago, and it is different. I've worked in an office for 40 odd years, or just under 40 years, and having to work from home, it is a different thing, because you get up in the morning, you go downstairs, you don't go anywhere. You sit in your sort of designated office. Your wife's running around with her phone and grandchildren appearing, and I think some people have struggled to cope with that. So the progress, we've got a range of support accessible to all colleagues. Counselling, it's called a go-to group, which is a group of officers that are there to have conversations, have a chat with, to help any sort of issues be solved. Informal peer-to-peer conversation, coaching, mentoring, counselling, and occupational health. So it's quite substantial. I'm not aware of the take-up, but I'm pretty sure there is a take-up on this sort of stuff. And then finally, creating a diverse and inclusive workforce. Now, this is one, we got a disability inclusion group that I'm chairing as well. And we're looking to try and employ more people with disabilities, or more people with disabilities applying to work for the council. And we've got an action plan to attain the disability confident committed status. This is a government run scheme. It used to be called the 2 Ticks for Disability scheme, which we're a member of. That was scrapped probably 3 years ago. And we've signed up for the disability confident project. And we've attained committed status, which is the first level. We're looking now to work towards the employer status, which is level 2. And within that, it's us being a welcoming organisation. If you are disabled and you satisfy the criteria for the job, you then are guaranteed an interview. And obviously, we ask the question then in terms of, have you got any specific needs for the interview? Are there accessibility issues in terms of, say, a screen reader, having more time to answer questions, etc. There's a whole host of things involved with that. But I'm quite proud of what we've done with that as a small group of officers with a real commitment to get more people out of the houses and into work. It's at a very early stage yet, and we're currently working towards level 2, and currently trying to find out how many people this has really had a good impact on. And then the final one, then, a more diverse workforce. I think guaranteed interview schemes for reservists, veterans and spouses. I think this is quite important. I think to do with the armed forces covenant that we've signed. So this again has been agreed by council and now in place to assist people who, from the sort of army background and assisting them back into a career with the council. I know this is something the council's keen to do as well. So it's supporting our army veterans, so to speak. Finally, we'd be glad to hear reducing the gender pay gap. And this is something, I think equal pay came out in 1973, and it's amazing that the world really is still looking to try and close this gap in 2021. It doesn't say much about what we've done as a society over those years, really. But what we've got to do again in terms of the Equality Act is looking to reduce this gender pay gap. So our desired outcome is a contribution towards breaking the cycle of gender stereotyping that exists in society and it has a negative impact on gender pay equality. To look at alternative ways of recruiting staff to break down the barriers of gender stereotyping. So progress on that. The council carefully ensure that we do not reinforce gender stereotyping and our recruitment campaigns consider such issues. For example, we understand that the language and word choice in advert and visuals in a campaign crucial to avoid unintentional gender bias. If you see, I don't know, a picture of a mechanic, it could be a man with a spanner in his hand, but there are females out there. There's nothing to say that women can't and actually do go into these fields. So we've got to be careful when we don't want to be setting that gender stereotype in terms of how we are setting out our adverts and our adverts in terms of looking for people to fill vacancies. And we are seeing impact in the makeup of the workforce in some areas, and we're working towards becoming more balanced. Well, that's essentially, and that's just a snapshot within there. There's a gender pay report. I think this was appended to the papers for this report, so people can look through that. Any questions they want to ask me out of the meeting, if they want to look through the document again, I'm happy to try and answer. Or if I don't know the information, I can certainly try and get that information. But happy to answer any questions if I can answer them.
That's very helpful. Thank you very much indeed. Appreciate all the information that you've just told us, but obviously reading through the report, there are lots and lots of useful examples. You've picked out a few, but the examples are excellent. I mean, there probably are questions, but you would possibly need to take away, or we can ask you outside the meeting, as you said, because obviously many departments are involved in all of these actions. Right, we've got some members wishing to ask you questions now. We've got Jamie Trehan and then Maureen Powell. Perhaps I'll invite Councillor Trehan first.
Yeah. Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Alan, for this report. Detailed and informative. I've got a couple of questions, please. with the disability aspect of things, and guaranteeing interviews and things like that, my question is are we actively, or can we provide employment for people who are coming up to retirement or have retired? Do we look at that area of people, if that makes any sense? And the gender pay gap, the term gender pay gap to me is very confusing, and I can't think of the one word I use now, because it, as I understand, it's the gender pay gap is the difference between the pay for different jobs. Now, when I read that term, I automatically think it's a difference between pay for male and female in the same job. So because it actually reflects different jobs for salaries, I think the term gender pay gap is misleading as well as confusing. So is that a Welsh Government legislative term, or is it just something that local authorities have been using over the years?
If I try to ask, I agree. It could well be confusing. If I try to ask that first one, I think what you're trying to allude to there is there a limit on who we would look to employ? But obviously, there's within the protected characteristics. So one of the protected characteristics is age. So age really shouldn't make a difference in terms of when you're looking to try and employ somebody, because what you're employing is someone with a tremendous amount of experience. And I think over the years there's been a tendency. I'm not saying in Monmouthshire now, but I think in society as a whole, I think once you get to a certain age, you think, well, he's too old to work. But actually, what you do bring to the table is that tremendous level of experience. Trying to balance that as well about the fact you also want to try and bring young people into an organisation. So no, there shouldn't be a barrier in terms of age. I mean, there's a friend of my family. He's 80 years of age. He's running a business in Crosskeys, and he loves it. So you can't really put an age limit on how long people can work, and as long as they're still viable to the organisation, then having that mix of youngsters with that that sort of real dynamism and energy, and someone with that wealth of experience and knowledge, because as long as the head is still working, that's the thing. I think that's the thing we forget with disability, is that it may restrict them in terms of some of the physical stuff or whatever, but actually the mental capacity is still there to provide a tremendous service. So it's the reasonable adjustments you can put in place for people with disability. I mean, now we're working remotely. Somebody that's got a physical disability that would have an impact on them being able to reach an office wouldn't necessarily, in this particular time, be an issue, as long as they've got the equipment that they can use. If they've got a visual impairment, they can use a screen reader, or hearing impairment. There's all sorts of software available that they can carry out a job the same as anybody can. So that's what it's about. I think there's a very good friend of mine in the village whose son's got autism. He's got O levels, he's got A levels to a high degree, and he went for a work experience with Tesco's, and they left him working in the fridge area with nobody else. And they wondered why then he walked out, because he needed people to tell him exactly what to do. They just didn't know how to look after him with his particular needs. I'm glad to say that our team with Steve Cooper and Molly Richardson are going to interview him now and try and place him with somebody and monitor him and mentor him in a role, which I think is what needs to happen. So there's so many things going on in the background. Going back to the gender pay gap, it is a confusing one. But I think it's about not necessarily having the same pay for the same jobs. It's about comparable jobs. It's about that sort of job evaluation. I'm saying about comparability in terms of level of responsibility. I suppose you could argue at the moment. I mean, we got an issue in another conversation, white versus social services. Having a conversation about how do we get more carers. Well, it's about do we need to properly assess the qualities and skills needed to be a one-to-one carer, home carer, a personal carer, about the level of responsibility they have? I think that's possibly something that we need to address in society at the moment, is paying them the right money, the appropriate level of money for those jobs. Because at the moment, I think because of what they're getting paid, they're seen as undervalued for what they need to provide. Because they're one-to-one with somebody in somebody's house, and something happens, they've got to sort that problem out. Not working in a team of a load of people that can say, "I got a problem. Can you help me?" These people are on their own with medical issues, mental health issues, etc., etc. So, yeah, gender pay can be confusing, but it's about saying that there's a sort of predominant female-oriented role, predominant male-oriented role, and having that difference in them. And why is that? And it's saying we should measure the skills required regardless of the gender of the person involved. That may not be a very technical response to that question. It's a difficult one to answer, but hopefully that will give you some idea.
Yeah, thank you, Alan. It's the term gender that's the word for me, because it implies that a male or a female gets paid more than a male or female for the same job. And
I think that's probably where it's come from. I think historically, that you've got two jobs you could say are fairly level in terms of skills and responsibilities, etc. But that, because this is a female-dominated area, it's not paid as much as that male area of that job. I think that's what it's about, and that's why we're saying about having this sort of flexibility now, or because there is a lot of gender stereotype about bus drivers, lorry drivers, taxi drivers, crane drivers, etc., and so on. That's male. Teaching assistants, carers, and so on are female. But actually, no, these roles and responsibilities and areas of these career areas, it shouldn't be a gender sort of stereotype for these. It should be open to everybody. And if you can get that, then you start getting that balance being sort of coming back to a level point. It's a complicated area, and I can't pretend to know an awful lot about it. But what you did say, it's part of the Equality Act and what we've got to report on in a specific piece, and it's there. It's a title we've got to use for it. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you, Alan. Thank you, Chair.
Thanks.
My microphone didn't want to unmute then, sorry. Okay, thank you very much for that. Councillor Powell.
Thank you, Chairman. I'm sorry, but it's going to be a little bit along the same line. I think it is. It's just the part of the wording, I think, because I can go back, because I'm a great age, to when I was working on a farm, and I did exactly the same work as the cowman, and he had not quite twice as much, or very nearly twice as much money a week as I did, and we accepted it then because that's how it was. But in this day and age, it isn't. This day and age, it's the job and it's that price, and it doesn't matter whether it's a woman or a man. And my eldest daughter, she's retired from it now, she's just farming now, but she was a long distance lorry driver, driving Arctics and cranes and the whole lot, and her boss favoured her more than the others because she didn't knock the tack about, and she went all over the country. I mean, it didn't make any difference to her, and people didn't treat her any differently. But I can see what you mean. Some jobs you expect to be male and some jobs you expect to be female. But in this day and age, look at the number of young men who stay at home and look after the children because the wife can get a better paid job in their sphere. So it balances out like that. So I think what it is, it's not the fact that there is a gender difference. I don't think there is. It's just how it's worded when it's put there. And I think people are reading into it more than there is. But your report is very, very interesting. I'm really pleased that everybody, whatever their age, ability, disability, or whatever, is going to be offered jobs and given jobs that they can cope with. And it's so much better than it used to be years ago. And thank you very much for your report.
Thank you. There's still a long way to go. I mean, I can't pretend we're cracking any of this. I mean, I think we've got to work harder in terms of getting more people with disabilities into work. That's a definite, and I can't say we're anywhere near cracking that yet. But it's so important. Think of this young lad I know. He's so intelligent. But, you know, he's got it, and autism is it's like a social disability in a way.
Yeah,
because it's about the way they
grandson's autistic. So
yeah. It's a very difficult area, isn't it? Because we're not, we don't. Only people with disabilities can understand what that disability is like and how it impacts on them.
Yes,
and that's the important thing, is talking to people and getting their sort of perspective on it, isn't it?
And a lot of them are like that. Well, my grandson's saying, if you're with him and telling him what to do, and you're in the room with him, he'll do it. Once you're out of him, he stops. And I can quite understand the gentleman you're talking about.
Yeah.
Because he had nobody with him. No. He got no guide or anything like that. And I think it's quite important that it is found a way around that.
Yeah. They also, he was cold in there, and he needed a coat. The coat wouldn't fit him, so they gave him a high-vis vest.
Oh,
and he then stood out from the crowd, and that freaked him.
Oh, dreadful! Yes,
freaked him. You know what I mean? It's that understanding.
Years ago, in the education department in Hereford, the gentleman that was in charge of all the phones, the telephonist, I suppose you call him, he was completely blind, but he was absolutely brilliant at his job. So even in those days, you know, there were people that were had a disability of some sort that were employed. And I hope that it continues and that everybody can be found a job. That's
an interesting point, that is. I mean, I think going back, even when I worked in Blaenau Gwent, I'm moving back to about 2010, there's two people there who were totally blind, that they were on switchboard. Yeah. But actually, they were on switchboard because that's as far as the authority felt that they could progress as officers. But the skills they had, and the software available to allow them to undertake other roles, you know, it's crazy. So we've got to push the boundaries in terms of if these people got these qualifications, it's putting those things in place to allow them to carry out even more creative roles and more responsible roles. But it's an interesting area, certainly.
Thank you very much.
Okay.
Thank you, Beth. My internet's playing up a bit, so if I freeze, don't be surprised.
Right.
Okay, sorry about that. I've got a couple of little questions. I didn't want to rush you on this, but as I said earlier, you've got such a lot of information in the report that it's all very clear to us, so there's probably not too many questions. On page 11 of Objective 3, there's a reference to the Box Clever digital platform. Have you got any idea it's resumed or likely to
right, bear me a second. Bear me a second, I'm trying to scroll. Which one was you? Sorry, which one did you say it was now?
It's on page 11, under Objective 3.
Yeah.
Accessing
right, I beg your pardon.
Areas that we had funding for, didn't we? We were awarded some funding for it.
No. It's a good question, that is. Now, at the point of writing this report, it was delayed by pandemic. No, I've not heard. The trouble is, I think with these reports, of course, I prepared this probably over a period of about 3 months. So when I wrote that in, that's the situation as was then. I've not heard to the contrary whether that's progressed at all. But if you want to pop me a little email, I can certainly find out from the person responsible. I can see where they are with that one. Maybe it's progressing, Sen. Yeah.
Yeah, I appreciate that a lot of this information is you collated and put together.
Yeah. Well, actually, we're a lot to yeah. I mean, normally this was presented about last April next year. Yeah. We decided to bring it forward because there was such a delay between the end of March and the following year. Oh, my phone's gone off in the background now. Sorry. There we go.
Just another question then. There's a reference to the socio-economic duty under poverty.
Yeah.
What impact is that going to have on these reports? And, you know, additional work involved.
The socio-economic duty is it's a part now of our integrated impact assessment process. So when an officer's carrying out an impact assessment, as they're called, they've got to consider that. So if there's anything within a report or a policy improvement that potentially have a negative impact financially, then they've got to try and consider that within that report. To date, I mean, I'm guessing it would probably come around more in terms of the budget process would have a socio-economic impact, or we're looking to try and revise a pricing strategy and so on. It hasn't really come to play so far. I haven't really had an example within our integrated impact assessment process where it's been picked up or it's not been picked up and I've picked it up. I think when we see it, we'll know it. Yeah. And I think when we see it, then we'll sort of take action. I think to me, it's not really cropped up yet, because some of this, the integrated impact assessment documents is now a big document, and there's lots of areas it covers. But it's true to say that not every report that goes to, say, cabinet or council or to individual cabinet member decision doesn't necessarily impact on all those particular areas. So it's we'll recognise it when we see it. I know it's not a very good answer to that particular one. I'm sure
it's an measure. It's an important measure, but that we just want to look out for. Yeah, we've all got to read the reports as they are, and this additional measure is something that we can look out for.
Yeah, I mean, I think because it came in just at the end of last March, or the March just gone now. Prior to that, we were aware it was coming in. It was something actually that should have come in when the Equality Act came in, but nobody within, because it didn't come in. The Equality Act came in London, in England, and then in Wales and Scotland, we could then change the regulations and include or not include whatever we wanted to. Now, in Wales and in England and in Scotland, didn't include that, but we've actually included impact assessments, which they don't have in England, interestingly. But we think is a really good tool to help you make proper decisions. But knowing that when they said it was going to come in, and they kept on delaying it, I don't know why they delayed it, but we looked at poverty as an issue anyway. And I don't know if you were aware of the cumulative impact documents that we were doing with the budget process. So where a family on below the poverty line or on or around it had kids in school, weren't having free school meals, so therefore had an increase in school meals. That the mother worked, say the mother or father worked in Abergavenny and had to park and pay for additional car parking fees, council tax going up, etc., etc. All those small things that somebody on a very good income or a reasonable income, those small incremental increases wouldn't have a proportionate negative impact on your take-home pay. But somebody on low income or just above that poverty line, it's quite a high cumulative or percentage impact on, say, someone that's on 15 grand a year, and they got to look for another £200 a year for those rises. So that's what we're looking at, really. That's a piece of work myself, Richard Jones, David Barnes, and Matt Gatehouse have been doing every year. The social justice really now has sort of taken that on a step. Good. We haven't really tested it yet, but I'm sure it'll come in. Hallelujah moment, and we'll see one.
Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you for explaining that to me. It's very helpful for us all. Okay. So, well, thank you for this report. I'm asked members if they're happy to accept it. I think you've put as I said earlier, you put an awful lot of information into it. So, I'm quite happy to accept it, and I ask members if they agree. And it's
yes, Chair.
Yeah.
Yes, I'm happy to accept it, and thank you, Alan.
Yes. Here we are.
Pleasure.
Happy to, Chair.
We'll miss you when you retire.
How do you know I'm retiring? Oh, heck.
Seem to freeze again. Yeah. Right.
Yeah, this is the last one. This is the last one.
Give you our thanks once again, and pleasure. This is an annual report, but I understand you might not be presenting it next time.
Yeah, I think this is the last one. I think. Yeah, yeah.
I've lost my I've lost my sound.
Yeah. All right. Yeah. Yeah, I think myself and my wife are considering going at the
You
end of
can
March.
hear me. I'll just switch to my phone.
Yeah, sure.
We can hear you,
I haven't
Sheila.
used the phone for this before,
we can hear
so
you,
bear
yeah.
with me.
Yeah.
My
May I
speakers have
make-
gone for some reason.
May I just make a comment to Alan? Don't be defeatist, Alan. I mean, my husband continued working into his mid-80s, and it was a source of huge amusement to his colleagues who said, "Well, what's Jeff doing now?" He kept coming out by popular
It's
request.
not on that. Oh, right, I can hear now on my
Sorry,
phone.
Jeff. May I just make a comment to Alan?
Right.
Don't be defeatist, Alan. I mean, my husband continued working into his mid-80s, and it was a source of huge amusement to his colleagues who said, "Well, what's Jeff doing now?" Coming out by popular request.
I've got a bit of a lag, so I didn't pick up what you said, Alan.
Yeah. No, we think, myself and my wife are thinking of going now at the end of March. I'll be 60 then. She'll be 59. So I want to spend more time with the grandchildren, and I'd have done 41 years in local government. So there we are. Plenty more to life than work. But right, yeah. No, we think, myself and my wife are thinking of going now at the end of March. I'll be 60 then. She's 59. So I want to spend more time with the grandchildren, and I'd have done 41 years in local government. So there we are. Plenty more to life than work. Right, yeah. One thing I won't miss doing meetings on Teams.
Oh, I don't know.
I got
I
a
am
bacon
sorry.
butty waiting for me as well.
Them jaws for dinner then.
Yeah. Yeah, lovely.
I think I'm going to have to close this meeting.
Right.
It's getting out of hand.
Yeah.
Sounds good, yeah.
Thank you very much, Chairman. Thank you, Alan.
Thank you, Sheila. Thanks so much. Cheers.
Thank you, Sheila. I think it's we're going to get a double
Sorry, it's
double
gone.
whammy.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Alan.
Yeah, thanks everybody.
Nice.
Bye.